The northern forest was frozen in the embrace of a merciless winter. Snow, like an endless white blanket, covered the earth, hiding even the tiniest details under its icy cover. The frosty wind penetrated everywhere, its cold fingers creeping under clothes, making any traveler shiver from the piercing cold. But Tom, accustomed to harsh conditions, walked forward, clutching an old rifle in his hands. His goal was simple: to find game to survive this long and merciless season. His steps were confident, but in his soul, he felt weariness. The forest, usually full of life and sounds, now seemed as if it had sunk into silence. Only the crunch of snow under his boots accompanied his solitude. Tom stopped for a moment to catch his breath, and suddenly his attention was drawn to something strange. Amid the monotony of the white, snow lay a dark spot. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. Approaching closer, Tom realized that before him was not just a random trace. It was a she-wolf. Her condition was shocking. Her fur, once probably thick and beautiful, was now dirty and matted, frozen from the snow. The animal's body was painfully thin, and her breathing was weak and intermittent. Her eyes, dull and full of pain, looked at him without hope, as if she had already accepted her fate. Tom knelt beside the she-wolf. She did not try to run away, did not bare her teeth, did not make a sound. It seemed she no longer had the strength even for instinctive defense. Her belly, rounded from pregnancy, was the only sign that life still flickered in her body. Tom felt something tighten in his chest. He knew that without help, the she-wolf and her future pups would not survive. Leaving her here meant signing her death warrant. Tom slowly took off his backpack and pulled out a piece of jerky that he had planned to eat later. He carefully extended it to the she-wolf, then gently tossed it in front of her muzzle. The she-wolf raised her head, slowly sniffing the air, as if not believing that food was actually in front of her. Her eyes looked at Tom, and he noticed in them something more than animal fear. It was an expression of deep exhaustion and resignation. "Come on, girl," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible in the icy forest. "You need this more than I do." She cautiously reached for the meat, weakly nibbling it before starting to eat. Tom continued to watch as she, with difficulty chewing, consumed the food. Each of her slow, painful swallows echoed in his heart. His gaze lingered on her eyes, in which a faint spark of life flickered. "Winter," he suddenly said. "That's what I'll call you. Your fur reminds me of snow, but in your eyes is the cold of winter and its relentless struggle for life." The name seemed to suit the she-wolf. Tom sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He already knew that he could not just leave her there. Winter had become for him not just an animal in trouble, but a symbol of that stubborn strength that fights for life, even when there is almost no chance left. New snowflakes began to fall from the sky, their light dance in the air, a stark contrast to the heaviness of what was happening. Tom stood up and looked around. A decision had formed in his mind. He needed to return to his cabin, gather everything necessary, and build a shelter for winter that would protect her from this merciless winter. But before leaving, he looked at the she-wolf again, who, having finished eating, lay back in the snow. He saw how her body weakly lowered, but her eyes no longer looked so empty. In them flickered a faint glimmer of hope. It was a sign that perhaps she was ready to fight for life. Tom adjusted his backpack and headed back through the forest. His steps no longer felt so heavy. Ahead of him was work, but he felt that it was the right decision. Behind him, amid the endless whiteness of the snow, winter remained, and her quiet, still living hope. The sky above the forest darkened rapidly, covered with heavy snow clouds. Tom hurriedly walked towards his home, feeling the cold wind intensifying, urging him forward. Thoughts of the she-wolf he had named Winter did not leave him. Her weak gaze, rounded belly, and quiet resignation, like a living memory, haunted him with every step. He knew that time was short. The approaching storm could be fatal for her and her unborn pups. Tom's cabin was simple but reliable. Inside stood a table, a bed made of rough boards, and an iron stove in which a weak fire flickered. He quickly gathered everything that could be useful: thick blankets, an axe, rope, and several pieces of wood. His movements were hurried but confident. Long years of living in harsh conditions had taught him to act without delay. Outside, the blizzard was already gaining strength. Snowflakes swirled in the air, merging into a dense white wall that made visibility difficult. Tom wrapped himself in his old woolen cloak, slung the gathered supplies over his shoulder, and went back into the forest. Each step was difficult, but he stubbornly moved forward, driven by a single goal: to save Winter. At the place where he had left the she-wolf, everything was the same. She lay in the snow, her breathing seemingly weaker than before. Tom knelt beside her and spoke softly. "I'm back, Winter. Soon you'll be warm." The she-wolf lacked the strength even to look back, but she twitched her ear, as if understanding his words. Tom quickly set to work. He cleared a small area of snow, then began to build a simple shelter. His hands, stiff from the cold, struggled with the axe, but he did not stop. Branches and logs lay one on top of the other, forming a rough but sturdy structure. Inside, he laid a soft bed of moss, leaves, and the blankets he had brought. By evening, the shelter was ready. It looked modest, but its thickness and sheltered position could protect against the harshest conditions. Tom carefully wrapped Winter in one of the blankets and lifted her in his arms. Her body was light, almost weightless, which only strengthened his resolve. He carried her to the new refuge, laying her on the soft bed. "You're safe now," he whispered, covering her with another blanket. "I'll be back with food tomorrow." Tom stayed with her until darkness fell, listening to her weak breathing. When the first stars appeared in the sky, he finally rose. His heart was heavy, but he knew he had done everything possible to give her a chance to survive. The storm began to gain strength as he returned to his cabin, but in his soul burned a spark of hope. Hope that Winter would endure this battle. The storm raged all night, howling with wind over the forest and whistling in the cracks of Tom's cabin. Obviously, the frost intentionally knocked on his window, testing the strength of the glass and wooden walls. Tom could not sleep. His thoughts constantly returned to the she-wolf, to her weak breathing and the spark of life he had seen in her eyes. He wondered if she would survive this winter night. Early in the morning, when the storm finally subsided, Tom wrapped himself in his warm cloak and, taking a backpack with food and water, went back into the forest. The path was difficult. Deep snow hindered every movement. Cold air bit into his face, but Tom did not stop. His concern for the she-wolf and her future was stronger than physical fatigue. Approaching the shelter, Tom slowed his steps so as not to frighten her. He peeked inside and breathed a sigh of relief. Winter was alive. She lay on the bed of moss and blankets, but this time her eyes met his gaze. Tom noticed in them not only a source of light, but also something new, a faint spark of trust. "Good morning, Winter," he said softly, kneeling in front of the shelter's entrance. The she-wolf lacked the strength to rise, but she weakly twitched her ear, responding to his voice. Carefully placing a piece of fresh meat and a bowl of water in front of her, he brought it in a small metal container. "This is for you. Try to eat. You need to regain your strength," he added, watching as she cautiously reached for the food. Each of her movements was slow and tense, but she ate, and this gave Tom hope. As Winter ate, he spoke softly to her, telling her about his life, about how he ended up alone in this harsh forest, and why he decided to help her. Her eyes, despite the decline, looked at him with attention, as if she listened to every word. "You're strong," Tom said. "I saw that in you from the beginning. We'll make it." Staying with her for a few more minutes, he checked her shelter, added more moss, and adjusted the blankets. The she-wolf watched him, her eyes no longer expressing fear. Tom felt that a bond was beginning to form between them, thin but real. When he was about to leave, Winter quietly raised her head and looked at him briefly, as if trying to protect him. Tom smiled, his heart warmed by this gesture. "I'll be back soon," he said, straightening up. "We still have a long way to go to restore you, Winter." Leaving the shelter, he felt that he had taken a step forward on this difficult path. Trust was beginning to emerge between them, which could become the reason for Winter's salvation and her future pups. This time his steps were lighter, and in his soul flickered hope. This she-wolf, despite all the difficulties, possessed an incredible will to live. Winter in the forest remained harsh, but in the shelter built by Tom, something new was beginning to emerge. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and every morning Tom went to the she-wolf to make sure she was enduring the protective measures of the environment. Their bond grew stronger, but he knew that the decisive moment was imminent. Her lowered belly indicated that the pups would soon appear, and this simultaneously filled his soul with anxiety and hope. One evening, when a strong wind tore branches from the trees, Tom felt a strange sense of urgency in his chest. He closed the book he was reading by the fire and stood up. His heart beat faster. Something was wrong. Without thinking, he put on his cloak, grabbed a lantern, and headed into the forest. The storm grew even stronger, snow swirling in the air as if dancing in a chaotic rhythm. Tom made his way through the snowdrifts, heading towards the shelter he had built for Winter. Upon arriving, he realized that his fears were not unfounded. The shelter was empty. A faint paw print, barely visible due to the snow, led deeper into the forest. Tom's heart tightened. "Where are you, Winter?" he whispered, rushing along the trail. The lantern light flickered, and soon Tom found her. She had taken refuge in a small cave, which she had probably found herself to endure this moment. The she-wolf lay on her side, her breathing heavy, and the air was filled with tension mixed with primal strength. Tom knelt down, approaching carefully. "It's okay, Winter. I'm here," he said softly, his voice full of calm and confidence. She turned her head, looking at him briefly, but showed no aggression. Tom understood that she trusted him. He sat down next to her, trying not to interfere, but to be there to help if needed. Outside the cave, the wind howled, but inside it was quiet, only her breathing and faint sounds indicating that life continued. Time passed agonizingly slowly. Tom did not take his eyes off, watching as the pups were born. The first, a tiny ball, uttered a weak squeak, barely touching the cold ground. Then the second, the third, and the fourth. Tom felt his eyes fill with tears. It was a miracle that he could not express in words. "Well done, Winter," he said, barely holding back the tremor in his voice. "You did it." The pups, still blind and helpless, instinctively reached for their mother. Winter carefully licked each one, checking them, as if reassuring that everything was okay. Tom noticed how she became a little more relaxed, her breathing slowed down. Indeed, she felt safe. Tom spent a few more hours with her, carefully wrapping them in his cloak so that the cold would not penetrate the cave. The pups, though small, had already begun to make faint sounds, which sounded like confirmation of new life. When night turned into early morning, Tom realized that Winter and her little ones were okay. He stood up, but before leaving, leaned towards the she-wolf. "I'll come tomorrow," he said softly. "You're not alone now." Winter looked at him briefly. Her amber eyes seemed full of gratitude. When he left the cave, his heart was tense with fatigue, but filled with wonder. Throughout his life, he had never felt as strong as he did at that moment. Behind the tiny lives born in the harshest conditions, a strength was revealed that set the world in motion to continue its journey. Spring slowly began to remind itself in the distant forest. The snow reluctantly began to melt, revealing the hidden earth beneath. Light streams ran down the slopes. Tom continued to visit the cave, watching as Winter regained her strength and her pups began to grow. They were happy, lively, discovering the world every day, and Tom felt like part of their new family. However, the forest was not always so safe. Tom knew this better than many. One day, returning from another visit to the wolf family, he noticed tracks in the melting snow. These were not wolf tracks. They were human. Tom stopped, carefully examining them. They were fresh, possibly left just a few hours ago by someone heading towards Winter's cave. Tom's chest tightened with a sense of urgency. He quickened his pace, heading towards his home where weapons and other supplies were stored. The forest was too quiet. His thoughts insisted that danger was near. Reaching the cabin, he took his rifle, a supply of food, and immediately headed back to the cave. The pups were still too small, and Winter had not yet fully regained her strength. He had to protect them. As Tom approached the cave, he heard voices. Low, rough, overpowering the sound of the wind. They seemed alien in this place. Carefully clutching the trees, he approached the people closer and saw them. 3 of them. All were armed, their clothing indicating that they were experienced hunters. Tom held his breath when he heard their conversation. "I'm telling you, there's a wolf family here," one of them said. "I saw the tracks. If they reach the farm, they'll start killing sheep. And probably at pups," added the second. "Better to take care of this now." Tom felt his hands tighten around the rifle. He knew that these people would not leave until they killed the pups. The decision formed in his mind instantly. He revealed himself, standing so that the hunters noticed him, and raised his hand, attracting their attention. "Hey," he shouted loudly. The men turned, staring at him in surprise. "There's nothing to do here," Tom said firmly, approaching closer. "There are no wolves here. We saw the tracks." One of the hunters began, squinting. "What are you hiding?" "You won't find anything but trouble if you continue the search," Tom said, his voice calm but threatening. "I've lived here for many years. If the wolves were in danger, I would know about it. These animals hunt far from the farm." The hunters exchanged glances. Their gaze was heavy, but doubt was red in them. Tom thought he had a chance to convince them. "If you kill these wolves," he added, "you'll disrupt the balance. They don't cause harm, but if they're gone, other animals will take their place, and that could become a real problem." The men, though reluctantly, began to retreat. One of them glanced at Tom. "I hope you're right. But if we hear about attacks on farms—" "There won't be any attacks," Tom interrupted, his gaze unwavering. When the hunters left, Tom breathed a sigh of relief. However, he knew that this was only a temporary victory. He had to be on guard, protecting Winter and her family from any threat that might appear. The spring sun filtered through the dense foliage, setting the forest ablaze, which gradually awakened after the long winter. Tom stood in the caves, watching Winter and her growing pups. They were no longer the fragile and helpless creatures he had first seen that snowy evening. Now they were young, energetic wolf pups, ready for their new life. The pups played, pushing each other and chasing fallen leaves. Tom couldn't help but smile, watching their childish carelessness. The black wolf, who had appeared in their lives a few weeks ago, was also there. He lay nearby, watching the little ones play, as if taking on the role of a second protector. But Tom knew this moment of joy was only temporary. It was time to let Winter and her family go into the wild. Her place was not here, next to a human, but in the forest where she could live as nature intended. He knelt to enter the cave. Winter, noticing him, came closer, her amber eyes meeting his gaze. In them was understanding and something that could be expressed as gratitude. "It's time, Winter," he said softly. "You and your pups need to return to the forest. You no longer need my protection here." He began to dismantle the shelter that had served as their home in the past months. Slowly and carefully, Tom removed the branches and blankets, returning it to its natural state. The pups, as if understanding what was happening, fell silent, watching him. When the work was done, Tom turned to Winter again. He reached out, gently stroking her head. This was their last contact, a farewell filled with silent respect. "You'll make it," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Your spirit and your pups will be the same." Winter looked at him for a few seconds before quietly growling, as if giving a command to her pups. They rose and gathered around her. The black wolf also stood up and prepared to join them. Tom took a step back, giving them space. His heart ached with pain, but he knew it was the right decision. He watched as Winter led her pack deeper into the forest. Her silhouette disappeared among the trees, leaving him alone. Several minutes passed, but Tom did not move. He stood in the same place, listening to the sounds of the forest that reached him like an echo. The parting was heavy, but inside he felt pride that he had helped Winter and her family. A year later, on one of the autumn days, Tom went into the forest again. He did not expect anything special, just decided to walk along familiar paths. But suddenly he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a howl, deep, pure, filling the forest with ancient power. He raised his head and, in the distance, at the edge of the clearing, noticed a familiar figure. It was Winter. Her amber gaze met his, and he felt that she recognized him. Around her stood her grown pups, now strong young wolves. Their family had become part of this forest. Tom stood, listening to their howl, and his heart filled with joy. They had survived. They had become stronger. Winter had shown him that kindness and care could change the life not only of animals but also of a person. At that moment, he felt that he had become part of something greater.